Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Wowza webinar. In the webinar today, we're going to talk about the Wowza Streaming Engine REST API and how to customize your streaming solution. And the agenda today, we're going to discuss business benefits and also the technology benefits of using the REST API to develop your own streaming solution. We're going to talk about how to get started with the REST API documentation with an actual demo. And then we're also going to show you ways to query the Wowza REST API service with some curl examples as well. Joining me today is Jamie Sherry. Jamie is the Senior Product Manager of Server Technologies. Jamie, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Absolutely. And also joining us is Matt Young. Matt Young is a support engineer, and he's going to be showing us actually how to get started with the documentation. Matt, thanks for joining as well.
Yeah, happy to be here. Look forward to speaking with everyone.
And finally, Richard Lanham, who's our support developer. And Richard's actually going to be showing us some real-world examples, how to pull in some REST API commands and show that inside of a web interface. Richard, thanks for joining us as well.
You're welcome. Thanks.
So, Jamie, let's go ahead and start with maybe distinguishing the differences between the APIs that are currently available within Wowza Streaming Engine. Can you give us a rundown of maybe the differences between the Java API and the REST API?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Hello, everyone. So, as you may or may not know, Wowza Streaming Engine is built on top of Java, and what that means is that we've had this for quite a while, actually since the history of the product creation, is a Java-based API. So this API is typically low-level feature extension and customization. So you can use the product to integrate with other systems, whether they be web servers, databases. You can even deal with things like images and storage and other pieces. So this API also allows you to get down into the low-level aspects of content manipulation, creation, and delivery. Separate from that is the REST API. The REST API and Java API will have overlap, by the way. There'll be some functionality you can do in both. We will do our best, obviously, going forward to make sure that it's understood which you should use for which situations. But in general, the REST API, newer piece of technology, as Ryan said, is what our user interface is built on top of. So the REST API has technically been out since 4.0. It's been out in the wild. It's been used by the user interface in previous versions. Effectively, in 4.2 is when you first can really use this with great ease. We did do about a 6 to 9 month preview. Got a lot of good feedback on the REST API and its use by itself. But in general, the REST API is used mainly for configuration management, monitoring, and even analytics. It's used much more for surface type situations around those areas. So that's the primary difference between the two. Again, though we overlap in some situations, but you should hopefully now have a clearer indication of when to use which one.
And I think with the REST API, let's talk a little bit more about what REST is, how it's used. There's a quote here that says, the RESTful interface creates a level of simplicity that didn't exist previously. And simplicity speeds things up, makes integrations more cost effective. And I think that's one of the true benefits of the REST API and using REST API to develop your applications. So really, what is REST? Well, REST is representational state transfer, and it's a software architecture style for building scalable web services. And these web service APIs can adhere to the REST architectural constraints. Those are called RESTful APIs. And the one thing that really distinguishes REST from maybe other APIs is the fact that you can do everything through HTTP. So this is using standard HTTP methods. You can use internet media types for data transfer like JSON and XML. You can use base URI identifiers, hypertext links, and so on. So by using these HTTP requests, you can actually administer a lot of the features that's available through that REST API through HTTP instead of having to do it through proprietary code or deeper level code integration. So Jamie, I think this is a very useful question for people who maybe are attending the webinar today is why use REST at all? Why are our customers using REST currently?
Right. Yeah. REST, different from SOAP and other methodologies of APIs, is creating an opportunity to become a lot more simple, flexible, scalable in the sense of what people are building in distributed applications across the internet. So whether it's performance or the simplicity or the scalability, flexibility for future proofing what you do, the REST allows the client and the server to actually communicate and be less concerned with the technology at hand. Obviously, the communication is specific to some certain languages, but as people start to use different languages to do application development, REST can keep up much better with the technology change than some of the previous technologies. They were very locked down, and when servers would change, the technology had to change or adapt, things like that. So.
Absolutely, and I think that the big thing with REST API is we see customers using this, like mentioned here on the slide, for enterprise-level integration, people building entire solutions, web-based solutions with Wowza kind of powering the live streaming and VOD streaming component of that. And same from the UI development side is just very similar to what we've done with our Wowza Streaming Engine Manager. You can really build your own user interface, add your own branding, have Wowza running at the core of that, the Wowza Streaming Engine server software, but really create your own interface and add value-added features that maybe aren't available within our core product. And then, like it mentions here, it's highly scalable as well. With REST API and the HTTP request, you can really scale this for large audiences. So like I mentioned at the top of the webinar, or ahead of the webinar, is our own manager is built on top of the REST API. And this browser-based management with the manager allows you to set up your streaming applications, manage your streams, monitor and measure video and audio streams. And Jamie, I think this, while I pulled up the actual manager interface itself, maybe give people who are on the line a rundown of the response we've got from customers in launching this manager interface, and also the fact that this has really been our own preview. By using this over the last year and a half, we've kind of, I guess, solidified our own REST API with the core functionality of the manager.
Definitely, yeah. As I said, when version 4.0 went out, we built the UI and released the UI on top of the REST API. So the REST API was essentially out there in production, and it wasn't open to people to use necessarily. But the use of the user interface, Wowza Streaming Engine Manager, has been well received. People, there were various set of customers that were looking for that leap from the XML configuration and other ways to configure the server into the more graphical interface approach. So that's been great. It's been well received. And again, as we've said, the manager itself and its functionality and operation has been a good test of the REST API, separate from the previous beta that we ran, where people were testing the REST API by itself. So definitely a good testament to the stability and the availability that'll be coming soon for the REST API, and the user interface is not for everybody, but I still think whether you're a novice or an experienced user, and you know XML, that there'll be situations where you might prefer to use the interface over the REST API or XML.
Yeah, and I think that the reason we mention this is the fact that the best use case or the best example we can give is the manager that we built ourselves using our own REST API, and I think that's really the case for Wowza bringing it up today. So now that we kind of defined maybe what REST API is, I'm going to pull in Matt Young and Richard Lanham now and talk a little bit more about how we can actually install, configure, and use the REST API. And Matt, maybe you can give us a quick overview of kind of what's involved with our new Wowza Streaming Engine 4.2, how people can actually install and activate and configure REST API and start using it.
Sure, yes. So we do have some nice supporting articles. So when you get to the point of embarking on this, you can load this documentation up, and it basically runs you through the steps needed to enable this on your server. So there's a couple of pieces. One is there is a documentation server, which will give you all the information you need to eventually run all of your requests against the REST API. And the way that you can do that is kind of illustrated here, where you just turn the documentation server on through the server XML configuration file, and you just enable it, and then you can modify the port, but I wouldn't recommend doing that, at least initially, because if you intend on using our Swagger UI, we have scripts that you can download right from this article to do that, and they all default to 8089. So just as if you're trying to get up and running, the good first step would be just to kind of leave that as a default, so you can experiment with the API as you see fit.
Now, Matt, maybe explain to people, what is the Swagger user interface when it comes to documentation?
There is this download here you can get on the instructional page, which will give you a set of HTML files, amongst other things. And when you download it, you can click on the index file in that download, and it'll pop up, as long as your Wowza server is running, it'll pop up this interface, and you'll be able to kind of get a glimpse of all of the different operations you can invoke on your server and on the REST API. So a very simplistic one is just to get a list of applications. It kind of gives you the endpoint by which you would run that GET request on. And then when you run it, you'll give you the actual output as well. So the response body, code, and the headers that coincide. Similarly, if you wanted to add an application, so this is a little bit more tricky in this interface, but once you get the general concept of how to orient the JSON syntax, you can put this same type of information in here, and this kind of automates the HTTP request that you would need, in this case the post command, to add a new application. And you can see you get similar types of responses. This time I did a JSON request, so you get JSON response, and it tells you it's successful. And you can kind of get a feel for the different types of operations you could run, and then which you'll probably take away to your custom applications. The other little note you can do here is that you can click on the model schema, and it'll kind of give you a breakdown of all the different types of fields as a template, and it'll pre-fill that for you, and you can modify it as needed. It's just kind of a helpful little hint for when you're trying to make requests against the server. When you configure this on your server XML, there's a couple of things to take note that we've seen a few people run into, which is if you enable the XML file, and some people turn this to true, expecting that just allows for an XML response. It doesn't. Basically, when you enable this, it gives you the ability to run another endpoint, which will allow you to get the configuration files back in a request. So if you made a request to see the server.xml, it will give you a truncated version of that back. So for security concerns, it's usually not something we advise you to turn on at all. But if you are testing and I'm not sure of every use case, but there's some use cases where this could be turned on. But if you have it turned on, your documentation server won't function correctly. And the other thing to note is when you first enable it, we specify that you turn the authentication method to off. This is for local testing. Whenever you go into production, though, we do suggest using a digest authentication for your regular REST requests. And the last piece here worth noting is that you'll want to ensure you include the HTTP headers, and all this information is in that document we were reviewing. And the other one that's sometimes missed that's is not necessarily highlighted in the article is to add the content type header. So it's one thing I've seen people not include and then run into problems when doing various post type requests. When you do start the documentation server, you'll notice in your logs that port 8089 is bound. And then when you run different types of requests, you'll see success or lack of within the logs as well. We do have a curl documentation here where you can just run different examples of curl requests to kind of see also how you might apply the REST API to your particular workflow. So in this instance, if you want to get like a list of applications, you run a very simple curl request using get, and you'll see like the JSON return for all of the different types of applications you might have. And then there's a whole list of different types of things you can do moving forward from that.
So one thing I think it's kind of worth mentioning and covering is, before Wowza Streaming Engine 4.2, you had to actually request a separate license for the REST API. And Jamie, now with the REST API with 4.2, it's actually included in there that your regular license, whether it be your trial license or whether it be your monthly subscription license, actually gives you access to that REST API. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. So the best approach if you're on a version previous to 4.2 is to upgrade to 4.2. Outside of that, there are some situations that we can discuss where people can still use the REST API on previous versions, but that's the general recommendation.
So Matt, were you going to pull up some examples of how to actually use curl to query?
In this context here, you can run a curl command, and basically the only pitfalls I've seen people do in this context is either to the header that you need, or headers that you need to pass, or have the endpoint just incorrectly formatted. So a very simple example here to coincide with the Swagger example we did previously. Running this endpoint with a get verb will give you the list of your entire applications directory. And you can see I specified JSON as the accepted type. So that's what I get in return. So in this article here, you can see similar completed requests. So if you run these on your own server, you can pretty much copy and paste if you're running it locally to test out some of these different types of requests. And we cover everything from application to stream management and even some statistics and logging. So there's lots of different examples you can run to just get started. And speaking of the digest authentication, if you are going to production with this and you do try digest authentication, then running from the tool itself, you can just pass in the digest parameters, and this should allow you access moving forward. Another similar example is a small PHP script wrote for a customer was essentially to disconnect a stream. So this would be a put command, and it's simply just wrapping curl within PHP. But you can see the headers that have to be required, ensuring the correct verb being used, and then the digest authentication. You can do that similarly here by passing in the right parameters.
And I think this is a great piece of code to show, Matt, because this really does show how the REST API and the curl commands can be used inside of really any coding language. So here you pulled it into PHP, but just as easily you could pull it into Ruby or iOS or Android code and be able to use that same REST API, HTTP headers to be able to pass those commands.
Right. Yeah. It does make it simple that you just have to pass, or you just have to use all your requests over HTTP. So it definitely makes it pretty wide scaling in terms of using it in whatever language is your favorite.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of kind of different examples, if you didn't have anything else to show, Matt, I was going to turn it over to Richard and have him maybe show us some of the examples of what he's been able to build.
Yeah, sounds good. Perfect.
All right. So I've built a couple of things around the Wowza REST API, involving, in this case, 2 servers and some pretty simple utility thing that a lot of us want to do quite often, which is copy applications from one server to another.
So in this example, Richard, you're actually able to pull up both, a local server and then the other server looks like it's local too, but then be able to copy applications between the two with this piece of code that you've written on top of the REST API.
So I'm basically doing several basic things in the REST API. One is looping through all these applications, doing a get on each application, and using it as the body for a post, in this case, to create a new application, and or put, as I put it, as I set this up as a fallback. So, for example, if I copy these 2 applications with this selection, one of them will, and I log it all here, one will copy and one will update.
Now, Richard, in this example, are you just using some PHP code to actually do this?
In this case, I am just using pure JavaScript. It's a little HTML page, and right. This is that particular example, and a relatively small amount of JavaScript, and which centers around XML, HTTP request, API, and JavaScript. Much of what I've focused on doing has used the Swagger layer, which is basically represented by a table of contents and details about each API. And you saw one representation of it in the Swagger UI that comes bundled with that particular tool that we use for this. And this is basically just another rendering of the same thing. For example, application operations here, APIs within that, and here's one of the simple ones we just used in that other application that just lists all the applications. I'm doing a simple get on the application, which is giving me the entire detailed configuration for that application, and turning it around into a post create a new application, which then I can do a get on and get the details on. But this shows the details of the API, and this is stuff that's annotated into the Wowza core that exposes all these different parameters of the API, which is useful, as a learning and reference, but it's also useful directly in applications, as I've shown, and all that's very useful to application development. So this whole thing here really is just another form of the Swagger documentation, another UI for it, and it's basically only for discovering what's in the Wowza REST API. And this is really exactly the same thing, although it's a completely different rendering of it, and it's simply for rendering curl examples, each one of these, and it's bundled exactly the same way, or compressed, so to speak, in the same way by these table of contents items, and each API and each method within the API is shown here. Okay, then I also built top-line data here, bytes in and bytes out, and in the chart, here's one with shorter data.
So very similar to what we've built into our kind of manager interface and be able to visually represent some data. You could very easily build that in here and be able to plug in those REST API calls and represent that visually.
It's using the same APIs that are running those charts when you go to the home page of the manager.
Absolutely. Cool, Richard. Well, let's go ahead and jump back in. So a couple of questions that we have here. One of them is about SSL support. What support is available for SSL? Can certificates be bound to a host address? I think we can, right, Matt? You can enable SSL for the REST.
Yeah, you can define that within the server XML for the REST endpoint, at least.
And another question here is about how to develop for HTTP provides or modules, or can everything be handled by the REST API now? Maybe give us an answer to that question.
Generally, there's a lot of functionality now that you can access through the REST API, so the convenience is there. However, at this point, it's not everything, so a lot of purely custom operations will probably still have to be done within or dealt with in a module or HTTP provider.
Yeah, one use case we get asked about is, can I extend the UI? And that's not a use case we're supporting today. Down the road, we leave it as a future consideration. We will probably, in some controlled ways, allow that, but right now, extending the UI to do your own UI functionality is not what we intend the REST API to be.
Absolutely. And, a question I have from Beltran as well is, the examples we gave today are all kind of running locally, on your local host, but you can just as easily, have SSH control to an Amazon Web Services AMI and be able to do a lot of the REST API development on a virtual machine in the cloud. Yeah, so we don't really restrict you. As long as you have access to the server itself and can SSH into the server, you could, just as easy run the commands and activate the REST API there. So you're not constrained to just a local environment, although, it's probably advisable to develop locally and then deploy out in the cloud when, you've developed your application. As far as sample code, Richard did pull up some examples. Currently, all we have available is what's in the support forum, so the curl examples that we have in there, and then, of course, the article on how to access documentation. So we are looking into potentially having some examples for different code bases, so whether that be PHP or iOS or Android. Currently, we don't have any code available. Is that correct, Jamie?
So our start is to provide these documentation examples using curl, keep it kind of neutral. We do intend probably over time to add language-specific examples to our support area to become available, but nothing is available at this time.
An interesting question I had too was, just mentioning cloud. This has been very focused on Wowza Streaming Engine, the REST API for our server software. If you guys are aware, we actually launched a Wowza Streaming Cloud service, an end-to-end live streaming service earlier this year, and we are currently in the process of developing a REST API for that as well. Currently, that's in a private preview, but we are hoping to, of course, release that publicly or do a public preview later this year. So a lot of the functionality is going to be different than what you can get in the Wowza Streaming Engine, but of course there's different functionality with our cloud product than there is with the engine product. But all I'll say to that front, you can definitely watch this space. As soon as we do launch any kind of a public API for Wowza Streaming Cloud, we'll definitely let you guys know and put it out there and do another session similar to this, focusing on the cloud implementation. Well, this is an interesting question for you, Jamie, or I guess for everyone, but Shaik is asking a question, can we use a REST API with the trial license?
So with 4.2 and forward, the REST API is on, it's enabled, it does not require any additional configuration as far as license keys go. It does require the documentation stuff that these guys previously talked about. But when we talk about versions that are less than 4.2 down to 4.1, which there are a few that we've released, the non-commercial licenses will work with REST API right away. No separate license key required, but the commercial licenses require a separate REST API license key. My recommendation, again, as I said before, is to really the easiest path to go is to upgrade to 4.2. But again, we, in some specific cases, can still handle people who cannot go to 4.2 but want to use the REST API to test things out or try things.
And so regarding 4.2 specifically, I have the downloads page available, the installer page. When you sign up for a free trial license, or if you are a monthly subscriber or have a license, a perpetual license, you can log into your account on wowza.com and download the newest installers for 4.2. For several of our cloud installations, we're still in the process of rolling out some of our 4.2 AMIs or machine images for the different cloud partners that we have. In the very near future, we'll have 4.2 available across our cloud partners. And I guess Inderjeet is asking, by installer, do you mean Linux and Windows or a specific Windows one? So with the REST API, you can use it on any flavor of these different operating systems, whether it be Windows or Mac or Linux 64, 32-bit. So Chad's asking a question here. I'm new to the industry, looking to develop some mobile Android applications. How well would this platform work with mobile video streaming? So, there's a couple of different questions to answer there. One of them is from a mobile functionality perspective, how does Wowza perform? Well, the reality is we are able to put out, Apple HLS code, Apple HLS streams that can very easily deliver to iOS and Android devices from mobile. So from a functionality perspective, Wowza Streaming Engine is perfectly suited for that. Like with our own Wowza Streaming Engine Manager, from an HTML, CSS perspective, we did develop the user interface to be mobile friendly from a consumer perspective or an end user perspective. But I think this particular question relates to, actually developing applications for mobile devices. And that's one of those code bases that we've talked about potentially having some sample code out there eventually to be able to show some examples of how it works. And we have definitely plenty of customers who are being able to leverage the REST API with, different mobile device SDKs.
Right. Well, and if we reflect back on the contest that we had for the REST API, the winner was a mobile app. So mobile is definitely a place where this fits. REST fits well. Our user interface, not specific to REST necessarily, was designed, as Ryan said, with responsive web design. So it works well on iPhones and tablets and or mobile phones and tablets, all the different device classes. So mobile is definitely a space that we work well in, for sure.
But I do want to point out, if you do want to download Wowza Streaming Engine 4.2, you can also sign up for a trial and visit our support forum as well, where we have information on the REST API. The one thing I wanted to point out about support is, with the REST API, as you continue to develop, questions are sure to arise. Send an email to support@wowza.com. The more information we get in the support ticket, the quicker and more efficiently we can respond. The add-ons, as you guys may be aware, we made changes this year with our structure that now what we used to call the premium add-ons, Wowza Transcoder, Wowza NDVR, and Wowza DRM, are now included with the Wowza Streaming Engine subscription license. If you're a perpetual customer who still maybe wasn't aware of that, you can definitely reach out to support@wowza.com. But what Mark's asking here, are those add-ons exposed in the REST API?
To a limited extent, they all are. As we mentioned, the transcoder endpoints, they are offhand. They are the ability to add and modify transcoder templates, the ability to create and modify an application to be enabled for transcoding, and the ability to start an application, and the ability to start a stream in the case of media caster streams. In other words, for example, at least our IP cameras, you can start an IP camera through the REST API that would then kick off the transcoder. In Wowza, you don't start the transcoder directly. You start the stream on an application where the transcoder is configured. there's quite a bit of functionality in that example, and similarly in other DVR and DRM all have a number of endpoints.
So it brings up a really good point as far as what endpoints are available, and I guess that's kind of an evolving thing. Is as we launch new functionality into our own Wowza Streaming Engine manager, a lot of times we are inserting new endpoints into the REST API that we're utilizing ourselves for that manager. And I had a question here from Robert who's saying, is there a REST method for the push publishing functionality? And Jamie, with our 4.2 product, we actually pulled in a new feature called Stream Targets, and that's exactly what we've done there. Is we're using the Stream Targets functionality inside of the manager user interface to leverage the REST API endpoint for push publishing.
Right. Yeah, and going forward, you can assume that most features that have a UI component will have a REST API component. That wasn't said already. So.
Yep, absolutely. And just to give you guys an example, if you haven't seen 4.2, this is actually what Stream Targets looks like. So, what used to be, or what still is, the push publishing module that you had to administer through XML, we've now kind of put that into the manager interface. And what we're doing in here is now available through REST API functionality with Wowza Streaming Engine as well. So Beltran's asking, and Matt, it looks like you may have answered this, can you configure load balancing with a REST API? Are you able to kind of launch other servers, and how does it work for licensing?
Yeah, so the initial answer to that would be, well, you can define modules and server listeners, so you can set up the functionality for a load balancer on a Wowza server. Initiating new servers, probably that's not part of the that would have to be done through external means, but as far as defining the configuration for a load balancer, you can definitely do that.
Yeah, and that's actually a very good point, because to actually maybe spin up a machine image that's in with a cloud partner like Amazon Web Services, you would have to use their API to be able to do it. That's outside of the scope, of course, of our software. We're just the software that runs on the server, not the service itself.
Right, but with the two, I think the beauty of it is that now you could technically use both APIs, and you can scale your network programmatically just as you see fit. There's really no need for manual intervention once you would have that set up. You could click your way to expanding your entire network. So it's pretty cool.
Absolutely. So great, I do see a couple of pending questions here, but we are running to the top of the hour. I did want to point out that we have been recording the session. I know we were going kind of at a fast pace, and we covered quite a lot in the scope of the webinar, but with that, I'm going to cut it off there. I'm going to follow up with any pending questions that are out there. Jamie, Matt, Richard, thanks so much for being available and showing us through the REST API.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great, guys. And if you guys have any questions at all, send an email to support@wowza.com. We'd be happy to get you guys any help you need to get up and running with your own REST API development. So with that, thanks so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you guys in a future webinar. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.